Good morning, I'm Mark.
And I'm Eric.
And today, first of all, before I do anything else, I want to make a disclaimer about my dog Sam, who you've probably seen in previous videos, because he will invariably wander into the shot. So you just have to say hi, Sam, to yourself when you see that happen.
And he's providing commentaries. What's going on?
Probably. It's interesting. They can understand us, but we can't understand them. So I don't know, except for that guy, the dog whisperer, that has the TV show.
In our better moments, I think we can understand them.
So yeah, true. My wife can for sure. So we're going to talk today about hyperbole.
Mm-hmm. Because that's not a hyperbolic function.
Right.
It's a literary device.
Yes. And how it is picked up and used in the media for sensationalism of stories, for basically buying advertising or courting advertising dollars, and how it is also, especially over the last year and a half with the virus and the lockdowns and all the other protocols that we have, I think has tended to exacerbate the fears, the neurosis, the hysteria in general in the United States and a lot of the other countries that are dealing with this. So it's like there's seems like a determination to perpetuate conflict, division, and an everyday example of this that we've all seen is at the checkout stand at the grocery store. Mm. You look to your left or right, and probably in most grocery stores in the checkout line, you're going to see all of those gossip magazines, right? And all of the headlines have this divisive kind of story right on the cover. And it's even in the way that stories are worded. So-and-so was blasted by so-and-so, mm-hmm. or so-and-so slammed so-and-so for this vote in the Senate, or
so-and-so was eviscerated.
Yeah.
On the Senate floor today.
Right. And
all this overflown language, overinflated type language that so often appears in the media. And I agree with you, Mark, that it's very prevalent and I think very noticeable, much more so than it was, let's say, 15 or 20 years ago. The other day, I was watching a little clip on YouTube, for instance, that was a news clip from the 90s, and it featured Connie Chung, who was one of these news anchor types.
Yeah.
And I was listening to it, and I was sort of staggered by how even-handed and calm the presentation was. And to me, that was a marker of how much things have changed, mm-hmm. In what, a decade, more than a decade and a half, 2 decades, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that, the obvious question is what's going on, right? Which is what we hope to explore in this video. And I think at one level, what's going on is that with the advent of the internet and so many screens occupying our attention, our consciousness is much harder to arrest than it used to be in the past. Mm. So anyone whose livelihood depends upon arresting the public consciousness needs to go to further and further extremes in order to make that happen. And I think part of what we're noticing with respect to hyperbole is the linguistic side of that the language has to be much more inflated, much more overblown than it ever was in the past. But I would say that the other dimensions are also included in that. The images that get propagated via 21st century media have to be much more dramatic and much more compelling. And I think part of what's happening is, one way of seeing it is that back in the day, the news used to appeal to our mammalian brains more. So our mammalian brains, of course, include our cerebral cortices, which is, of course, the biological locus of our cognitive abilities and our higher functionings that we associate with being human. But I think now the emphasis in a lot of mass media, both linguistically and in terms of images and this sort of arresting element of it, it's an attempt to appeal to the reptilian brain. So the reptilian brain includes a bunch of structures such as the limbic system that are much more associated with immediate emotional response, like fight or flight, being scared, like all of those kinds of responses are more the reptilian, the inner brain, in terms of the geometry of the brain, rather than the rational cerebral cortices that we all have. So I think a lot of the media isn't really about making an appeal to the rational sense-making parts of us, but instead it's an attempt to appeal to the much more visceral, primitive parts of us that are ready for fight or flight, ready to be scared, and in a way, like delighting in what seem to be negative emotions.
There's a delight, and there's also a break, almost a dissociation in a way, I think, because take the January 6th, what's variously referred to as the March on the Capitol or the Capitol riot or several other terms that's been used for it, when they basically busted into the Capitol building and that was the tribalism, the mob mentality kind of, that's when that appeal to that more primitive, those more primitive functions come in. You can see it happen right on the screen.
Yeah, I like that observation, Mark, because what I'm sort of casting in terms of an appeal to the reptilian brain, you're sort of noticing has the element of tribalism, a more, I guess, primitive state than we like to think of ourselves in terms of, for sure. We like to think of ourselves in terms of being, sort of civilized, sense-making, rational, first world society. We don't like to think of ourselves as, susceptible to a kind of primitivism or tribalism. But I think that more and more with this appeal to the reptilian brain, we're seeing, I think, much more a kind of primitive factionalism is how I might describe it. It's manifesting itself. And by the way, it's not just the people on the far right. The people on the far left are prone to this sort of stuff too, like the Antifa type people. To me, is a kind of tribal movement, a tribal factional kind of thing going on.
Yeah, well, and an example of that would be that downtown section that they took over in Seattle last summer.
Oh yeah, the autonomous zone.
That would be an example from the other side.
So it's not limited to one end of the political spectrum or another. But even I think the fetishism that accompanies how everything is politicized these days, is another manifestation of the same set of sort of tribal, primitive, reptilian brain or semi-reptilian brain dynamics, and it's really remarkable.
There's also a historicity kind of element to this too. What I mean is there's a tendency for us in the 21st century to view time in a linear fashion, and to also view it as one thing that we infer from that is things in the past are ancient history, so to speak, ways of being, ways of discourse, ways of so the new is better, is progress.
Supposedly.
I thought of that when you mentioned how we see ourselves as supposedly civil society and so forth. And I don't think that's necessarily so. And I think we've seen that played out in the last 18 months.
I think so, more than 18 months, but especially in the 18 months. It reminds me a little bit of, how psychoanalytic thinkers, we were talking a little bit about Carl Jung before we started the camera, they often cast their theory and their work in terms of the return of the repressed, right? So, and different psychoanalytic thinkers have different ways of conceiving what that looks like. But, and I think part of what's going on today is, it's not so much that we've progressed or that we are progressing, but that what we have repressed as we've entered into modernity and now perhaps post-modernity is now returning to us in a sort of vicious cycle, like the primitivism that we thought we had somehow transcended is now manifesting itself in a new guise, and I think maybe the easiest location to see this, besides the news, would be the internet and people's practices on the internet and discussion boards and so on. And I think that, one of the markers of a very almost atavistic primitivism that is now manifesting itself in 21st century technologies would be the fact that everyone seems to be so eager to have an enemy. Everyone wants an enemy that they can point their damn finger at and call names, and whether it's like cuck or snowflake or fascist or racist or like everyone loves. The fact of the matter is we have not evolved beyond the need to have enemies. In fact, I think now it's even more obviously and floridly true than perhaps it ever was. Excuse me. Because, the dynamics of enmity, I think, are part and parcel of what's propagating the divisiveness across the cultural terrain, and I think that to speak in a quasi psychoanalytic way, I think the deeper truth is we love. We're orgiastically excited by the prospect of naming and identifying an enemy so that we can ourselves feel self-righteous and in the right and in the know and on a noble crusade to extinguish our enemy and to efface his or her presence from the entire landscape. What a fetishistic fantasy world we're living in. And I'm trying to say it in a sexualized way because I think there is a kind of sexual component to it. Like it is one of the manifestations of our libido, not to get too Freudian about it, but one of the manifestations of our libidinal energy, I think these days, is in terms of the dynamics of enmity and name calling and finger pointing, so that we ourselves can feel better about ourselves by putting other people down. Like it's an attempt to sort of build ourselves up by putting other people down.
And I think that also it has elements that's not necessarily as primitive, but more a result of or a development out of the Enlightenment too. The Cartesian way of separating things, we get our idea of ourself and a sense of ourself obsessively in today's culture, in the Western world, from delineating what is ours from what is not ours.
Yes. And I think what you're getting at is a very important point because, the dynamics of enmity are almost always justified in seemingly rational, seemingly plausible terms. But the reason why we need enemies in a semi-sexual kind of way is because we need identity. We're really looking for identity, a sense of ourselves. And this is sort of the cheap way of foreclosing on the struggle, is to think of ourselves in opposition to our perceived enemies. But really what we're looking for, none of that would be necessary if we had a more or less secure what would be the right word? A definite and secure sense of who we actually are. Like, you don't need to play a cheap game in defining yourself in opposition to someone else if you already have a sense of who and what you're about as a human being.
Well, and that that brings up the book that you've referred to before, Finite and Infinite Games.
Oh, yeah, James Carse. Interesting little book.
Yeah, take a note on that one if you're not familiar with it.
Carse, Finite and Infinite Games, written in the 1980s, I believe. Yeah.
But that, and also another thing about that is enmity is so powerful because it is held in higher regard because of what we see in the media. Everything we see in the media, and this kind of brings us back to the beginning of our discussion, everything we see in the media perpetuates contention. Almost everything. If you go and look on a daily basis and pick out 12 or 15 news sources and look for stories about peace and contentment and social discourse and
people getting
cooperation, good luck.
Well, as they say, no news is good news.
Yeah.
And that's an old adage, that's like, we're both sort of late boomers. That's been around longer than we have, right?
No news is bad news for selling advertising.
Well, yeah, it is. And here we're sort of edging upon the sort of economic element of this, which you mentioned in the beginning when you did your sort of initial lead in.
But I think it's all tied together.
Well, it is all tied together, and that's what makes it so damn complicated, right? So it's not a simple problem. It's not as simple as saying, well, damn, they need to start appealing to people's cerebral cortices a little bit more than the reptilian brain. That's too damn simplistic, because there are, although that I think that's true, there are also at the same time these economic exigencies. And the fact of the matter is people have to make a living somehow.
Yeah. So what brought this up for me was wanting to do this video was the way this has been almost magnified over the last 18 months with the virus, of this veneer of that we have of civility that is just has cracks all through it because of the strain and stress and anxiety that's brought on and perpetuated through these narratives. The latest one, of course, is the ivermectin versus the vaccine, the efficacy of ivermectin, and then people just in a blanket statement referring to that as horse dewormer, which is, it is a drug all by itself, but it's normally associated with livestock and agriculture and things like that. But anyway, it actually goes back to your point about politicizing everything, including medical decisions for our well-being.
Yes. In fact, I would say it's hard to find any news story that isn't politicized. For a while, I was thinking that, you can sort of trust the news media to tell you something that is politically,
Neutral.
Yeah, neutral. That's the word I'm looking for. Neutral. And I thought, is there such a thing, though? Because, even if you think of the most sort of innocuous thing that they might report, like the weather, it's going to be raining today. Usually the next sort of line that could easily follow upon that is, it's due to global warming and the bastards that pulled out of the Paris Accord. And isn't Trump one of those bastards?
And there's invariably then will be a jab at the other state channel who is out of a different political leaning. And
so it's hard to find any news story.
That's a very good idea, a point that you make, Eric. Of course, I'm on Facebook and you're not. But so one of the people that I follow on Facebook is a meteorologist in Atlanta, and sometimes he's had to shut his page down because he will forecast with the best models available the hurricanes coming up, which sometimes affects us here in Georgia, and or the thunderstorms that may come across from the west in the springtime and whatnot. And if it plays out badly for us, he gets the most venomous feedback and post, and that it's just I don't even know how to describe it. Sometimes it's so widespread and so
Prevalent.
so prevalent.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we're at the point where I could sort of trot out one of my homebrewed irresponsible bathtub theories about how the news is operating these days. And it goes something like this. I think the purpose of news in our era is not actually to inform us of anything. Right? So this is an old school narrative about what the purpose of news is. The old school narrative is that the purpose of news is to inform the populace of factual realities so that they can participate together in the running of a representative democracy, which is the form of government we have here in the United States. So the purpose of news is to help that process along by way of informing people. But I think the purpose of news is no longer to inform any of us. The purpose of news, it's not even going far enough to say that the purpose of news is to make a dollar by exciting us, which is kind of what we were saying a little bit earlier with the reptilian brain thing. But I think the real deep purpose of news, beyond even the reptilian brain thing, is to keep us perpetually uninformed. And the way that that's done is by distracting our attention away from the kinds of truths and verities that really matter in our lives, and to fixate our attention on the things that are
sensational sound bites.
Yes, like a kind of razzle dazzle, emotional kind of outrage. And I'm so outraged now, but at least I feel like I'm alive in my outrage, And so I think that the real purpose of news is to keep us from being informed about the kinds of truths that really matter, by arresting our attention and keeping us distracted. The band Tool has a great line in their song Vicarious, like we like to watch things die from a distance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
and I think a lot of the news is about that.
And one of the outcomes of that kind of interface with us is reactivity, of people reacting rather than giving a consideration to something, to a headline or a story or an event or a news article. There's a reactivity to it rather than trying to have some measured consideration of it.
Yeah, and for me personally, I think most of you who watch my other channels know that I'm sort of an inveterate meditator, and I one of the things that I do in my life is cultivate meditative consciousness, which is very much an open, unoccupied, unreactive form of consciousness in which reality itself, ideally, can present itself close to how it actually is. Let's put it that way. There's always going to be some bias and skewing. But to not be so susceptible to the kind of manipulation, I think, manipulation is the right word for a lot of what's going on. But to sort of view things from the point of view of silence, which is such an odd thing in our world these days. It's almost like a bizarre anomaly, to value silence above further distraction is almost marks you as a kind of heretic.
Joe Campbell said in his interviews with Michael, I don't remember his last name, but he said one of the most important things for him is to find about an hour each day in which you sort of close yourself off in a quiet space, wherever that may be, where you don't know what time it is necessarily, you don't know what's on the news, you don't know what's in the newspaper, and you just sit with that.
Yeah.
In that quietness, and that makes a lot of us uncomfortable to do that. It takes you have to have some intention with that in order to make it happen, I think.
I think so, and it's an acquired taste in today's world. The taste for silence.
And the other thing, because I guess we're going to probably have to wrap up pretty soon. We're at 25 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right.
But the other thing that can help with this, I think, at least for myself, is to learning to be less reactive. One of the ways I take that up is to try to distill out some other sources that are not on the checkout stand at the grocery store, but that will give me a more well-rounded idea about whatever the event or the headline of the moment is.
Yeah, like so seeking a sort of broad exposure to the news of the day rather than a narrow exposure.
Yeah.
I think that helps, but I think something that helps even more is becoming your own thinker.
Yeah, critical thinking.
Yeah, learning to see the world and the truths of the world from your own unique perspective and not from someone else's damn agenda. And, because I think it's not our best destiny to be someone else's trained monkeys.
Yeah.
And I think that a hell of a lot of that is going on with respect to news reportage and internet practices. Everyone's trying to turn everyone else into their own trained monkeys. And it's like, well, when you sense that happening, I sometimes would tell my students, a salutary thing you might ask at that point is, in whose interest is it really?
Who's benefiting
for you to believe what you're being told? In whose interest is it really? Because at one level, it might be in your interest. It might make you feel a little bit better, and it might give you a little bit of a sense of identity. And because you have an enemy that you can sort of hate and all of that, you can sort of experience the sort of sexualized eroticism of hatred, which is undeniable. I mean, that's part of our being. But I think to wonder a little bit about, as you're exposed, I guess this is maybe advice for you viewers. The first thing is to refuse to be anyone's trained monkey, including ours, by the way. Yeah. We're making this video. Yeah. And the second is to wonder, in whose interest is it really for you to believe X?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what the X is.
Well,
okay, so is that
we've covered some issues.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've answered any questions.
Well, we rarely answer any questions. Rilke once said that the point is not to answer questions, but to fall in love with the questions themselves.
There you go. There you go.
So maybe that's what this is about.
Keep questioning.
Yes.
Yeah. If we had to sum it up, I think that would be my summation: is continue to question.
Keep the questions open. So we hope you have a great one. It's a wonderful day here in Georgia, and Two Creeks Farm. It's his farm.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.